A father lay strapped to the operating table, seconds away from losing a kidney for his son, when the blinding lights burned into his eyes and the monitor pounded like a death drum. He had already signed the consent, already surrendered his body when the door burst open and his 9-year-old grandson stormed in breathless, his voice slicing the air. "I'll tell you why my dad really needs that kidney." The entire room froze. The scalpel hung in mid-air. And in that silence, the truth was about to explode. Subscribe now and drop a simple comment, your state, your city. Even just a number, before you hear what he revealed next. The surgical light burned into his eyes like a relentless sun, blinding and merciless, pressing down until his chest tightened with every breath. The cold steel beneath his back was unyielding, a slab that held him prisoner, while the steady beeping of the monitor carved into his skull, each pulse a reminder that he was seconds away from surrendering a part of himself he could never reclaim. He tried to shift his arms, but the straps cut into his skin, reminding him there was no escape, no turning back. The smell of antiseptic hung heavy, sharp enough to sting his nostrils, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean of hope. He thought of his son, pale and broken, in the room next door, the boy he once carried on his shoulders down the streets of their small town, now reduced to a frail shadow, who depended on his kidney to survive. That image clawed at his heart, twisting the knife of obligation deeper. It was no longer a choice, not when every doctor, every chart, every whispered conversation told him only he could save his son. And yet beneath the layers of love and duty there was a suffocating dread that felt like someone else had already scripted the ending, and he was just playing the role of a sacrificial pawn. The doctors moved around him in precise rhythms, their gloved hands gleaming under the light, their faces unreadable behind masks. To them, he was a procedure, a body to be cut open, stitched, and logged. To him, it was his life, the years he had worked, the scars on his hands, the aches in his bones, all reduced to a signature on a consent form that now felt like a death sentence. The nurse leaned over him with a syringe that glimmered like liquid glass. His throat went dry. He tried to swallow, but it was like forcing stones down his esophagus. Beyond the glass wall he could still see Melissa, his daughter-in-law, her arms crossed like a general inspecting the battlefield. Her eyes were cold, sharp, and commanding. Next to her, Mr. Harris straightened his pressed suit as though this was a business deal he had orchestrated, while Mrs. Harris dabbed her lips with a silk handkerchief, her smirk faint but poisoned. Their presence gnawed at him more than the straps, because in their stillness he saw ownership, entitlement, the certainty that he would give up his kidney and they would take the credit for saving David. They stood there not like worried family, but like spectators who had already counted the profit. The father tried to pull his gaze away, but the monitor's beep dragged him back into his own cage. It was no longer a sound. It was a hammer pounding away the last shred of resistance, breaking his will with ruthless precision. He felt the sweat pooling at the base of his neck, trickling down in thin streams cold against the sterile fabric of the gown. His jaw clenched until it ached. He wanted to scream, to tell them all that he wasn't ready, that something in his gut screamed this was wrong. But his voice was gone, stolen by the anesthetic haze that already crept into his veins, making his limbs feel heavy like stone weights pulling him under. He thought of the nights he had worked double shifts to keep food on the table, the blisters on his hands from hauling bricks, the exhaustion that followed him like a second skin. All of it had been for his sons, for David, and for Brandon. He had been their anchor, their shield, their constant. And now here he was, reduced to an organ donor, a body to be carved open, while the people he trusted watched with greedy eyes. The surgeon leaned closer, his voice calm, practiced, almost detached. "Just relax. Everything is under control." But those words, meant to soothe, only tightened the knot in his chest. Control. Whose control? Not his. His life was no longer his own. He was strapped down, silenced, his fate in the hands of strangers and family members whose whispers carried more menace than comfort. The faint reflection in the surgical lamp caught his own eyes, sunken, bloodshot, terrified. He barely recognized himself, the man who once stood tall, commanding respect with his silence. Now he looked like prey, cornered and trembling, waiting for the predator's strike. He blinked rapidly, trying to push back tears that threatened to spill, but the light forced them out, catching the edges of his vision, blurring the sterile world into streaks of silver and white. Every second stretched like an eternity. Every beep of the monitor a countdown to oblivion. He felt the edges of panic clawing at him, threatening to consume what little strength he had left. And yet beneath the terror a stubborn ember still glowed. He was a father. He had endured storms, poverty, humiliation, and loss. Could he not endure this as well? The question rattled inside him, but the answer was drowned out by the memory of Melissa's eyes, the way she had nodded outside that glass wall, as though she was the one who commanded life and death. The father's heart thundered harder, the monitor quickening its tempo, each beep now sharp enough to cut through the air. The nurse glanced at the screen and adjusted the drip with clinical indifference, but to him it was the sound of his cage shrinking, his world collapsing. His chest heaved as though the very air had turned into chains. He closed his eyes, searching for a fragment of peace, and found instead the face of his grandson, Ethan Jr., laughing in the backyard dirt, on his hands, sunlight in his hair. That memory burned brighter than the surgical light, a fragile shield against the suffocating present. He held on to it, clinging to the innocence of a boy who hadn't yet been tainted by greed and betrayal. And in that memory he felt something stir, an echo of resistance, a refusal to let his story end on this cold table. But the weight pressed harder. The straps dug into his wrists, the hum of the machines grew louder, and the footsteps around him blurred into a steady march toward an irreversible end. The syringe hovered closer, the liquid inside catching the sterile light, promising oblivion. His breath came shallow, uneven, each inhale a battle against the crushing air. The room itself seemed to lean in the walls, narrowing the ceiling, descending the surgical lamp, glaring like an unblinking eye. He was no longer a man, but a sacrifice, a lamb bound for slaughter under the guise of love and duty. The silence from his son's room next door was deafening, as though David's weakness had seeped through the walls and shackled him even tighter. His mind screamed, but his body betrayed him, paralyzed under the weight of inevitability. He could taste the bitterness of surrender at the back of his throat, metallic and sharp like blood. The doctor's voice came again, calm and absolute. "It's time." And with those words, the crushing pressure became unbearable, pressing down until every nerve in his body begged for release. And then, in the suffocating silence, the sound of hurried footsteps broke through. Not the precise rhythm of nurses, not the calm authority of doctors, but frantic, desperate, defiant. The door shuddered hinges, screaming, and the air shifted with the force of a storm about to tear through the carefully constructed calm. What happened next shattered the illusion of control. Through the glass he saw them, a silent tribunal seated in their self-appointed thrones. Melissa's arms were folded tight across her chest, her eyes cutting through the sterile air with the sharpness of broken glass. She didn't need to speak. Her gaze carried the weight of command, a chilling reminder that this surgery wasn't about family, wasn't about love, but about control. Beside her, Mr. Harris adjusted the cuffs of his perfectly tailored suit, a faint smirk curling at his lips, the kind of expression men wear when the game is rigged in their favor. Mrs. Harris leaned forward slightly, her manicured fingers tapping against the railing, a rhythm of disdain that echoed louder than words. They weren't here to support him. They were here to make sure he obeyed. The father felt their eyes pierce him like needles, cold and merciless, stripping away whatever humanity the doctors had left untouched. It was as if they had already claimed ownership of his body, as if his kidney had been signed over in some invisible contract that he never had the chance to read. He tried to steady his breath, but every inhale carried their presence deeper into his chest, pressing down on him, until he wondered if the straps holding him were even necessary. Melissa tilted her head just slightly, a gesture small, but loaded the way a puppeteer might twitch a string to remind the marionette who was truly in charge. Her lips moved slow and deliberate, forming words he couldn't hear, but didn't need to. He knew what she was saying. Do it. Do it now. Don't you dare resist." The room seemed to tilt under their gaze, the walls closing in like the glass itself was alive, tightening its grip around him. He remembered the first time he met Melissa years ago when she had smiled sweetly and shaken his hand, her eyes already calculating, already measuring what she stood to gain from marrying into his family. Back then he had dismissed it as nerves, the suspicion of an overprotective father. But now, staring into those unblinking eyes, he realized he had been right all along. Mr. Harris leaned close to Melissa, whispering something into her ear. She didn't look at him, just kept her eyes locked on the man strapped to the table, but her mouth curled into a thin smile, a cruel slash across her face that made his stomach churn. Mrs. Harris didn't bother with whispers. She mouthed the words slowly, as if savoring each one. "Do it." Her teeth flashed white against the sterile light, and in that moment she looked less like a mother-in-law and more like an executioner delivering the sentence. The father's pulse raced the monitor, betraying every surge of panic, every spike of resistance he tried to bury. One of the nurses glanced up at the sound, then quickly looked away, unwilling to acknowledge what everyone in the room must have felt, the tension radiating from that glass wall, a force heavier than the machinery humming around them. He wanted to scream, to tell them to leave, to tear away the masks and expose the malice behind those carefully composed faces. But his voice was locked inside, buried beneath fear duty and the creeping haze of drugs sliding through his veins. Melissa's eyes narrowed, her stare turning predatory. She leaned forward slightly, placing her palm flat against the glass, her red nails gleaming under the lights. It was a gesture of ownership, as though she were pressing her brand into him, claiming what she believed was hers by right. Mr. Harris joined her, nodding once, a sharp tilt of the chin that carried the weight of command. The father had seen that nod before, years ago, when contractors demanded payments, when bosses handed down ultimatums. It was the nod of men who believed they held the world in their grip. Every muscle in his body tightened under the weight of their silent orders. His chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate breaths. He wanted to believe he was still his own man, that no one could force him into this, but the reality stared back at him with painted nails and expensive suits. He wasn't just giving up his kidney. He was surrendering to them, feeding the hunger in their eyes, and once he gave it, they would never let him forget who had orchestrated it. The surgeon's calm voice broke through the suffocating silence, a reminder of the mechanical process continuing despite the storm outside the glass. But the words slid past him like water, meaningless against the roar of Melissa's stare. The father felt like an animal in a cage surrounded by predators who didn't even need to bare their teeth. Their silence was enough, their presence a weapon sharper than any scalpel. He tried to shift his gaze to find something in the room untouched by their influence, but everywhere he looked, their shadows followed. Even the gleam of the surgical tools seemed tainted by their control, every sharp edge reflecting not just light, but their expectation. He thought of David again, his son lying weak and helpless, oblivious to the theater unfolding just feet away. Did David know? Was he part of this silent demand, or was he just another pawn in their carefully laid game? The question burned in his chest, heavier than the fear, heavier than the straps. Melissa's lips moved again, slower this time, deliberate enough for him to read them. "We own you." The words carved themselves into his mind, searing through whatever resistance he had left. He wanted to deny it, to spit back with defiance, but his body betrayed him, frozen in place, silent under the crushing weight of their gaze. The straps were no longer the enemy. The enemy was the glass, the invisible wall that kept him from tearing free, from ending this charade with the fury that boiled just beneath his skin. And then, as his heartbeat thundered louder, as the suffocating silence pressed tighter, something shifted. A flicker of motion beyond the glass, small but jarring, like the first crack in a flawless mask. Melissa's eyes darted sideways just for a second, her confidence faltering. Mr. Harris's smirk faltered into a twitch. Mrs. Harris's fingers stopped their rhythm, frozen mid-tap. It was subtle, fleeting, but undeniable. Their control, their intimidation wasn't unbreakable after all. The father caught it, clung to it the way a drowning man clings to a fragment of driftwood. For the first time he saw fear in their eyes, not directed at him, but at something else, something approaching. The glass no longer felt like a wall of dominance. It felt like a shield, and whatever was coming would shatter it to pieces. And in that instant, with his chest heaving and his pulse racing, he knew their cold demands were about to be challenged in a way none of them expected. Something was about to break, and when it did, the entire balance of power would shift. He closed his eyes against the glare of the light, but it didn't erase the image in his mind. David lay in the next room, pale and sunken, a shadow of the boy he once carried on his shoulders through crowded 4th of July parades. The father remembered the weight of that small body, the sticky fingers clinging to his neck, the sound of laughter echoing down suburban streets. Now that same son was a grown man, broken his life tethered to machines, his survival hinging on the organ that beat inside his father's body. The thought should have filled him with purpose, with the fierce devotion that had driven every sacrifice of his life. Instead, it left him hollow, gnawed by an emptiness he couldn't explain. The monitor's beeping reminded him of every night he had worked late, bloodshot eyes squinting at blueprints under fluorescent lights, knowing that the overtime hours meant David could stay in school, could have a chance at something more than his own backbreaking labor. He thought of the mortgage payments he had covered, the car notes he had signed, the dinner skip so David would never know hunger. Those memories should have been fuel, but instead they cut deep because he couldn't shake the suspicion that none of it mattered. He had given everything, yet still ended up here, strapped down, his worth reduced to spare parts. He wanted to believe this was love, that he was giving his kidney because a father's duty never ends. But beneath that conviction lurked a darker question, one that clawed at him with merciless fingers. Was he doing this because he loved his son, or because he had been conditioned to? Was this still choice, or had his life been so consumed by sacrifice that obedience was all he knew? The glass wall loomed in his peripheral vision, and he couldn't shake the memory of Melissa's eyes, sharp, commanding, merciless. Did David know what she and her parents were doing? Did he see how they orchestrated every step of this nightmare, turning his father into a bargaining chip? Or was David too far gone, too weak, too desperate to notice? That thought pierced him deeper than any scalpel ever could, because if his son knew, if David accepted this twisted arrangement, then all the years of sacrifice had been for nothing. His chest tightened. He thought back to when David was 10, standing in the backyard, with a baseball glove too big for his hand. The boy had missed every pitch that summer, but the father had stayed late under the porch light, tossing ball after ball until his own shoulder ached. And when David finally caught one, his smile had been blinding, worth every bruise, every blister. That memory should have been a balm. Instead, it burned because the boy who once looked at him like a hero now looked past him, letting others decide his fate. The father's breath came shallow, ragged. Love was supposed to steady him, but instead it tore him apart. One part of him ached to protect his son, to do whatever it took to keep him alive. The other part whispered that something was wrong, that love should not feel like a noose tightening around his throat. His heart told him to save David. His gut told him to stop. The emptiness inside grew heavier, pressing against his ribs, demanding to be acknowledged. It was more than fear. It was the sense that he was being erased, that this wasn't about David's survival, but about Melissa's control. The way she had pressed her hand to the glass, the way her parents had smirked, the way the surgeon's words had felt rehearsed. It all fit together like a puzzle he didn't want to solve. He tried to imagine what Caroline, his late wife, would have said if she were standing in that room. She had been the fire in their home, fierce and protective, the kind of woman who would have torn down the glass with her bare hands before letting anyone dictate the fate of her family. She would never have let Melissa stand there, never have let strangers reduce her husband to a commodity. The thought of her absence was a wound that never healed, but tonight it throbbed like an open gash. For the first time he felt the crushing weight of facing this battle alone. The beeping quickened, echoing his thoughts. A nurse muttered something about his blood pressure, but her words barely reached him. His mind was too loud, torn between devotion and dread, between the past he cherished and the present that stank of betrayal. He wanted to believe in the boy next door, the son who once hugged him tight after striking out whispering, "Thanks for not giving up on me, Dad." But he could no longer ignore the silence of the man lying in that hospital bed now, a silence that felt complicit. Tears stung the edges of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He would not give Melissa the satisfaction of seeing him break. He forced his gaze back to the ceiling, but it wasn't the ceiling he saw. It was David as a boy, David as a man, David as a stranger. And with every image came the gnawing emptiness, a hollow pit that whispered the one question he didn't dare say aloud. Was this really love? Or was it the final act of a man who had given so much of himself that there was nothing left but obedience? The father's chest rose and fell every breath, a war between devotion and defiance. He knew the next moments would define not just his life but the truth of everything he had built. And just as that thought crystallized, just as the emptiness threatened to consume him whole, the silence shattered with a sound that made everyone in the room turn their heads. What came through that door was about to rip apart every illusion of loyalty, every shadow of control, and every lie they thought they had buried. The door slammed open with a force that rattled the instruments on the nearby tray, and the air in the operating room shifted as if the walls themselves recoiled. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was a boy chest-heaving, sneakers caked with mud that smeared across the polished tile as he stumbled inside. Ethan Jr. had run as though the world was on fire behind him, his hair damp with sweat, his small fists clenched at his sides. His wide eyes darted from the blinding surgical light to the masked faces frozen mid-motion, then to his grandfather bound to the table. He looked out of place in that sterile world like innocence dropped into a machine built for cutting and control, and that dissonance tore through the suffocating silence like a blade. The father's breath caught in his throat. His grandson's face, flushed and desperate, became an anchor in the sea of dread. Shock washed over him first. Shock that the boy had made it inside at all, that he had braved the fortress of hallways, nurses, and locked doors. Then confusion. Why was he here? Why now, when the knife was seconds from cutting? But beyond the shock and confusion, something else bloomed. Hope. Small, fragile, but real. Because only a child could shatter the script that had been forced upon him, only a boy untainted by fear or manipulation could drag the truth into the light. The doctors stuttered in their movements, their hands hovering uncertainly over gleaming steel. The anesthesiologist froze with the syringe still suspended, its needle gleaming inches from the IV line. The room moments ago, a machine of precision, had broken down into chaos gears, grinding to a halt at the arrival of a 9-year-old boy with mud on his shoes. Through the glass, Melissa's composure cracked for the first time. Her hand, once steady against the barrier, trembled as she slapped it flat, her nails screeching faintly against the surface. Mr. Harris leaned forward sharply, his jaw clenching tight, while Mrs. Harris's mouth opened but produced no sound, as though the breath had been ripped from her lungs. They had not planned for this. They had not prepared for innocence to storm the room and rip their control away. Ethan Jr. pointed a shaking finger at the surgeon, his small voice erupting with more power than the machines that hummed around them. "Stop. Don't touch him. You can't do this." The words cracked high and uneven, but they carried a weight that silenced every adult in the room. The father felt tears sting his eyes, not of weakness but of recognition. His grandson was standing where he could not, speaking what he could not, giving form to the resistance that had burned inside him but never found a voice. The nurse tried to move forward, her voice hushed and practiced as if soothing a frightened animal. "Honey, you can't be in here. This isn't safe." But the boy stood his ground, sneakers squeaking as he spread his feet wider, planting himself between his grandfather and the gloved hands ready to carve. His chest rose and fell like a warrior in miniature, and in that moment he looked more formidable than any of the adults who had filled this room with intimidation. The father wanted to shout encouragement, to tell him to keep going, but the strap across his chest held him still. his eyes wide and unblinking, locked with the boy's. It was enough. Ethan Jr. saw it. He nodded once, subtle but certain, and the father felt a surge of strength pulse through his veins, a reminder that he wasn't beaten yet. Melissa pounded the glass, her voice muffled but sharp enough to cut through the barrier. "Get him out! Now!" The command was shrill, desperate, stripped of its calculated composure. For the first time, her mask of control had slipped, and what showed beneath was panic. That panic spread to her parents, whose eyes flicked from the boy to the strapped man as if the fragile web they had spun was unraveling thread by thread. The surgeon cleared his throat, voice unsteady, trying to reclaim authority. "Young man, this isn't the place. Please step outside." But his words lacked conviction, his hands unmoving, his eyes betraying the hesitation planted by the boy's defiance. The power in the room had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Ethan Jr. pulled something from the pocket of his hoodie, his hand trembling as he held it up. A phone, old and cracked, the screen glowing faintly. His knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly. His voice cracked again, but this time it was steel beneath the tremor. "I know the truth. Everyone needs to hear it." The father's heart thundered in his chest, louder than the monitor that betrayed his fear. The sight of that phone, the weight in his grandson's words, made him realize this wasn't just interruption. This was revelation. This boy had come armed not with fists or fury, but with truth, and truth was deadlier than any scalpel. The doctors glanced at each other, uncertain, caught between their duty to the patient and the storm that had just broken open in front of them. The anesthesiologist slowly lowered the syringe, his hand trembling as if he no longer trusted the orders he had been given. The nurse stepped back, eyes darting from the boy to the figure on the table, as if she too felt the fragile threads of control snapping. The father drew in a shaky breath, his chest rising with something new, not just fear, not just love, but the raw electric charge of possibility. His grandson had broken the silence, shattered the machinery of intimidation, and for the first time since he entered that room, the father felt the weight shift off his chest. The straps still bound him, but hope seeped through, fierce and relentless. Melissa's fists pounded harder, her voice rising to a shriek that cracked through the glass. "Get him out before he ruins everything!" Her parents shouted too. Faces twisted with desperation, but their voices no longer commanded the room. The power had passed to the smallest figure among them, a boy standing in muddy sneakers, breathing hard, clutching a cracked phone like a weapon. The father's eyes never left his grandson. Every ounce of strength he had left, every fragment of will anchored to that child's defiance. He no longer felt like prey strapped to a table. He felt like a witness about to watch the balance of power tilt in a way no one expected. The silence that followed was heavy, electrified, the kind of silence that comes before an explosion. And as Ethan Jr. lifted the phone higher, his voice steadying with a courage far beyond his years, everyone in that room knew something unstoppable was about to be unleashed. The sound of the door hitting the wall still echoed when the boy's words cut through the sterile air, and in that instant the room froze. The surgeons, once moving in perfect rhythm, stood like mannequins under the glare of the surgical lamps. A scalpel slipped from one trembling hand, clattering against the tile with a metallic ring that seemed to reverberate forever. A tray of clamps rattled as another doctor fumbled the instruments, tumbling to the floor in a scatter of steel. The sharp clangs pierced the silence, then bled into it, swallowed whole by a tension that grew heavier with every breath. The father could feel it, that unbearable stillness pressing down on everyone's shoulders, bending spines, sealing lips. His own heartbeat thudded against the straps that held him loud enough to echo in his ears, and yet it felt like even that sound was too much an intrusion in the silence waiting to be broken. The anesthesiologist lowered the syringe slowly, almost mechanically, his gloved hands trembling as though he'd forgotten how to move. Nurses exchanged wide-eyed glances, their mouths parted but voiceless, as if fear itself had stolen language from them. All eyes turned to the boy standing in muddy sneakers at the edge of the sterile floor. Ethan Jr. clutched the phone tighter, his small chest heaving with the effort of defiance. The light from the cracked screen flickered across his face, painting him in sharp lines of courage and fear. His voice had been enough to bring this room of authority and control to a standstill. And now in the silence that followed, the weight of his presence loomed larger than the machines, larger than the professionals trained to command life and death. The father's eyes burned locked on the boy. He could see the determination etched into that young face, a face still too innocent to bear the burden it carried. His grandson had stormed through barricades of silence into a place where no child belonged, and yet here he was, standing like a barrier between his grandfather and the blade. The father's chest rose with something he hadn't felt since Caroline was alive, an overwhelming swell of pride mixed with terror. Beyond the glass, Melissa's composure fractured further. Her fists pounded once more against the barrier, her voice shrieking through the divide, though no words carried clearly inside. Mr. Harris barked orders at staff who hesitated, unsure if they should intervene, while Mrs. Harris pressed both palms to the glass, her face twisted with fury and panic. They looked like animals trapped in a cage of their own, making their claws useless against the silence that gripped the room. The doctors shifted uncomfortably, the authority in their posture fading. One bent to retrieve the fallen scalpel, but hesitated, his hand lingering inches above the floor as if touching it might shatter what little order remained. The monitor beside the father's bed continued to beep slow and steady, the only sound daring to challenge the suffocating quiet. The boy's breath echoed louder than the machine's. He opened his mouth and every spine stiffened, every gaze sharpened. The silence was a vice squeezing tighter, as though the entire room held its collective breath, waiting for the strike. The father's throat clenched. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, but his eyes begged the boy to go on, to release the truth that trembled on his lips. It felt like the world had paused, caught in the moment between lightning and thunder, between revelation and collapse. The father's pulse quickened with unbearable anticipation, each beat a drum calling for the next word. The boy's knuckles whitened around the phone. His lips parted and his voice began to rise, carrying with it the power to tear through the silence like glass under a hammer. And what came next would break more than just silence. It would break the lies that had poisoned this family, the illusions that had chained him, and the fragile mask that Melissa and her parents had worn for too long. Melissa's fists hammered against the glass with a violence that cracked through the suffocating silence. Her palms smeared the surface with frantic streaks, nails scraping until the sound sliced through the room sharper than any scalpel. Her lips moved in wild commands, her face twisted, her composure shattered into raw panic. For the first time, the mask she had worn so perfectly fractured. And what showed underneath was not control, not confidence, but fear. Real fear. The kind that could only come from someone with something colossal to lose. The father's eyes narrowed, a shiver of realization crawling down his spine. Until now he had drowned in uncertainty, questioning whether the unease in his gut was just paranoia, whether the cold stares and unspoken pressure were tricks of a weary mind. But this unmasked desperation in Melissa's face, this was confirmation. Suspicion hardened into certainty. She was hiding something so big that even a 9-year-old's trembling voice had the power to unravel it. Mr. Harris lunged forward, slamming his own hand against the glass, shouting words muffled into static, his authority breaking into ragged edges. Mrs. Harris clawed at the edges of the frame as if she could rip it from the wall, her eyes wide, not with anger now, but with a dread that drained the color from her face. The dynasty of control they had built was crumbling in front of strangers in scrubs and masks, and there was nothing they could do but pound uselessly against a barrier that no longer held the power they once commanded. The boy didn't flinch. His sneakers squeaked as he took a single step closer, his small frame somehow filling the sterile room with defiance. His hands shook, yes, but his voice cut clean, trembling with conviction. You need to hear this. You all need to hear the truth. His words ricocheted through the stillness, louder than Melissa's muffled shrieks, louder than the beeping monitor, louder than the doctor's shallow breaths. The father's heart surged. He could see it clearly now. The frantic pounding, the shrill commands to silence the boy, the way Melissa's eyes darted wildly as if searching for an escape. She wasn't trying to protect her husband. She wasn't even trying to protect the family. She was trying to protect herself. And whatever she feared being spoken aloud was about to break everything open. A nurse hesitated near the boy, her gloved hand suspended mid-air as if she might lead him out, but she froze under the weight of Melissa's panic. Even the staff could feel it now, that this was no ordinary outburst, that something poisonous hid beneath the surface. The surgeon adjusted his mask with shaking fingers, his authority crumbling as suspicion spread like wildfire through the room. The father strained against the straps, his body trembling not from fear this time, but from the clarity burning through him. His son's wife. The woman who had wormed her way into every corner of his family had built her empire on lies, and now those lies were cracking open under the defiance of a boy who refused to stay silent. Melissa slammed her palm again, her voice breaking high and frantic. "Don't listen to him! Don't you dare listen!" Her scream fogged the glass, her face distorted through the mist of her own breath. She looked less like the composed woman who had once charmed her way into dinners, and more like an animal cornered, snapping at anyone who dared step closer. The boy lifted the phone higher, his hands trembling so violently the cracked screen wobbled in the light. His eyes locked onto his grandfather's, and in them the father saw not just a child but a soldier, a messenger carrying the one weapon they couldn't strip away, truth. The room pulsed with suspense, every second stretched into an eternity. Doctors hovered in uncertainty. Nurses held their breath, even the beeping monitor seemed muted beneath the weight of the moment. Beyond the glass, Melissa's screams rose raw and desperate, but they no longer controlled the room. They only confirmed the truth that something monstrous lurked in the shadows she was desperate to keep hidden. And in the unbearable stillness, just as the boy's voice began to rise again, the father knew with chilling certainty that what was about to be revealed would not just explain everything, it would destroy the very foundation they stood on. The father strained against the leather biting into his wrists, but the straps held firm, pressing him deeper into the steel beneath his back. His body was a prisoner, paralyzed not by anesthesia, but by the cruel reality of restraint. He could not move, could not speak, could not even raise a trembling hand to shield himself from the chaos unraveling before his eyes. He was fully awake, painfully conscious, his senses sharp as glass. Every flicker of movement, every muffled scream, every gasp from the staff sliced into him, yet all he could do was watch. His chest rose and fell in frantic bursts, but no sound followed, his throat locked tight, strangled by desperation. He tried to will his body into rebellion. His fingers twitched against the straps, his toes curled inside thin hospital socks, his jaw clenched until his teeth ground together. Nothing freed him. Nothing broke the hold. It was a cruel kind of torment, trapped in his own body, forced into silence, while the people who sought to control him spun their web a few feet away. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat mocking him with its useless power. He had the strength to feel, but not the strength to act. His eyes darted to the boy, his only beacon. Ethan Jr. stood trembling but fierce, the cracked phone raised like a sword of truth. The father's gaze begged him silently, pleading for him to hold steady, to stand tall, to finish what he had started. He wanted to scream encouragement, to shout that he believed him, that he trusted him, but the words never reached his lips. All he had were his eyes wide and burning, a desperate bridge between them. And the boy understood. He nodded once, a small gesture, but it carried the weight of an oath. Beyond the glass, Melissa's frenzy grew louder, her body slamming against the barrier in blind panic. He could see the wildness in her face, the way her lips pulled back over her teeth like an animal cornered. Her father barked orders to no one in particular, his arms slicing through the air in gestures that reeked of command. Her mother pressed both hands flat, her expression collapsing into something closer to terror than anger. For the first time he saw them stripped of power, revealed not as architects of control, but as cowards terrified of exposure. Yet none of it eased the suffocating weight inside him. Powerlessness gnawed at him, a bitter taste that coated his tongue. He had spent his life building, providing, protecting, every action a testament to his strength. Now, as a father, as a man, he could do nothing. His body betrayed him. He was a witness shackled to the stage of his own undoing, forced to watch the drama play out without the dignity of choice. The surgeons shifted uneasily, their instruments untouched on gleaming trays. One rubbed his forehead beneath the mask, the sweat soaking through the thin fabric. Another stared at the boy as if hypnotized, his gloved hands dangling uselessly at his sides. The nurses whispered to one another, words lost in the heavy air, their eyes darting nervously from the boy to the glass to the man strapped to the table. It was as though the entire room had been swallowed by indecision, frozen between obedience to procedure and the storm of truth clawing its way in. The father's throat tightened. He thought of Caroline again, of the way she used to say his silence could speak louder than a room full of words. He wondered if she had ever imagined him like this, voiceless by force, silenced not by wisdom, but by cruelty. He blinked hard, fighting back tears, not for himself, but for the boy who stood unflinching under the crushing gaze of so many adults. His grandson carried a weight that no child should bear, and the father could do nothing but watch. He felt every second drag like a blade across his skin. The phone in the boy's hand trembled, its cracked light flickering across his determined face. The father wanted to scream at the doctors, to demand they listen, to force them to open their eyes and see what he saw. But the straps held, the silence held, and he was left drowning in the unbearable helplessness of being a man with no voice. The air thickened, hot and stale, pressing into his lungs like smoke. He drew in shallow gasps, his chest aching, his pulse screaming louder than the machines. His eyes darted wildly, searching for any ally among the staff, anyone willing to act, but all he saw was hesitation, fear, and the quiet cowardice of bystanders paralyzed by doubt. Still he refused to close his eyes. If he could not speak, if he could not move, he would not look away. His stare would hold steady, locked on the boy, feeding him strength across the distance. Let Melissa pound the glass. Let her parents shriek in muffled panic. Let the staff tremble in indecision. His eyes, his will, his soul, all of it belonged to the boy who carried the truth. And as the boy raised the phone higher, his voice breaking the silence with the weight of what he was about to reveal, the father knew that though he was helpless in body, he was not broken. Something was coming, something unstoppable, and once unleashed, it would tear the false order of this room apart. Ethan Jr. gripped the phone so tightly it seemed the cracked plastic might splinter in his hand. His knuckles had turned bone white, the tension in his small fingers shaking, but he refused to let go. His chest heaved in sharp bursts, each breath betraying the fear quaking inside him. Yet his eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, burned with a fire too old for a boy his age. Determination seared through him, raw and fragile, but steady as steel. He was only 9 yet. In that sterile room filled with masks and machines, he carried the unbearable weight of a man twice his age, the weight of truth that could save his grandfather or shatter them all. The light from the phone flickered across his face, illuminating dirt smeared along his cheeks, streaks of sweat glistening under the surgical lamps. The glow reflected in his pupils like two flames, each fueled by the secret he had run through hallways and barricades to deliver. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, the sound loud in the crushing silence. His gaze darted to his grandfather, bound to the table, eyes pleading, and then to the figures pounding against the glass beyond their mouths, moving in silent screams, their faces twisted in panic. The boy's lip quivered, but he clenched his jaw until it steadied. The father's chest tightened at the sight. Pride warred with terror inside him. He wanted to shout for the boy to run, to escape the storm about to break open, but the fire in his grandson's eyes silenced that instinct. The boy wasn't running. He was standing. And he was ready. The doctors had stopped pretending to lead. They stood suspended, caught between duty and doubt, their eyes pulled toward the boy as if drawn to gravity itself. One nurse pressed her hands together at her chest, whispering something under her breath. Another shifted closer, her body tense as though bracing for the blow that was about to fall. Even the anesthesiologist's syringe, still in hand, lowered it slowly to the tray, as if conceding to the higher authority in the room, the child's voice. Melissa's fists pounded harder against the glass, her hair sticking to her damp forehead, her composure ripped into frantic shreds. Her father's face twisted, red veins rising along his neck, shouting orders. No one obeyed. Her mother pressed her lips to the glass as though she could pierce through with her denial, mouthing words the boy ignored. Their terror was a storm outside the walls, muffled but unmistakable, and it only fueled the certainty that the boy held the kind of truth that could raise everything they had built. Ethan Jr. lifted the phone higher, his small arm trembling from the weight of defiance. His voice cracked when it first emerged, thin and uneven, but it carried across the room with the force of conviction. "You have to listen. You have to know what they did." His words trembled like his hands, but no one doubted the sincerity. His voice was a spark thrown into a room soaked in gasoline, and everyone leaned closer, waiting for the fire to catch. The father's eyes widened, a silent plea for the boy to hold steady, to carry it through. He had never felt so helpless, and yet so alive, pinned down but tethered to hope by the voice of a child. He wanted to scream encouragement, but his gaze had to be enough. The boy saw it. Their eyes locked, and in that unspoken exchange the man gave what strength he had left, and the boy accepted it like a torch passed from one hand to another. The boy's knees bent slightly, grounding himself, bracing against the trembling that threatened to betray him. He raised the phone until the cracked glass glinted under the lights. His thumb hovered over the screen, hesitated, then pressed. A distorted sound burst from the speaker, filling the silence with static, and then with voices. The adults in the room gasped. The father's blood ran cold. It wasn't just evidence, it was a recording. Melissa's reaction confirmed everything before a word even played. She screamed, her mouth tearing open in a raw howl that no glass could contain. Her fists slammed so violently the glass shuddered in its frame. Her parents lunged beside her, panic clawing across their faces. They knew what was coming. The boy's courage had cracked the door wide, and now the truth was spilling out. The staff froze again, caught in the storm between innocence and revelation. No one moved. No one dared. Every eye in the room was fixed on the tiny phone shaking in a boy's trembling hands, a device so fragile, yet carrying the power to detonate the lies that had bound them all. The father's pulse surged, his lungs burned, but he couldn't look away. The sound from the speaker sharpened voices, bleeding through the static words, forming with clarity that struck like lightning. The boy's hand shook harder, but his stance never faltered. His chin lifted with the weight of defiance. The silence had been broken. The lies were unraveling, and though fear still trembled in his small frame, Ethan Jr. stood unyielding. In that moment, the boy was no longer just a child. He was a herald carrying truth into a room built on deception. And as the first clear words rang out from the phone, cutting through the sterile air with deadly precision, everyone knew that nothing, not the straps, not the glass, not the carefully built walls of control, would ever be the same again. The father's gaze locked on the boy, but his mind began to drift, pulled backward through the years like film reels spinning in reverse. The cracked phone glinting in Ethan Jr.'s hands became a prism refracting fragments of a life built on sacrifice. He saw himself younger, sweat dripping down his temples as he stacked bricks under the unrelenting sun. He had taken every overtime shift, every night call, every back-breaking job because his sons needed more than he ever had. He remembered stumbling home at dawn, his boots caked in dust, his body breaking but his will unshaken, only to collapse in a chair at the bedside of Caroline. His wife, her face pale, her body weakened by sickness. She had smiled through the pain, whispered that he was enough, that he was holding the family together by sheer force of love. He had raised those boys in the shadow of her illness, becoming both father and mother, protector and provider. He cooked when his hands ached, cleaned when his eyes burned from lack of sleep, and prayed in the silence of nights when the world seemed intent on taking everything from him. He remembered tucking David into bed, brushing hair from his forehead, telling him stories about men who stood tall in the face of storms. He remembered Brandon's scraped knees, the nights of fever, the laughter echoing through a house that never seemed big enough for all their dreams. He had carried them all, held their lives together with calloused hands and unshakable resolve. The boy's small voice pulled him back, but the flood of memory didn't stop. He saw Caroline's face the day the doctor said she wouldn't walk again. He had knelt by her side, promised her he would never let the family break, that he would shoulder everything if it meant the boys could breathe easier. And he had kept that promise even as the weight crushed him, even as his own body cried out for rest. He had lived in service of them, carved himself hollow so they could be full. Now, strapped to a table, he realized how twisted it had all become. Those years of sacrifice had not earned him loyalty, but betrayal. His love had been weaponized, turned into expectation, until the only value they saw in him was the kidney beating inside his body. It wasn't just his son's life on the line, it was the cruel erasure of his own, a lifetime reduced to spare parts. His eyes stung, but he forced them wide, refusing to blink away the images. He remembered Christmas mornings where he had worked double shifts to afford gifts he couldn't wrap with trembling hands. He remembered the quiet birthdays where he saved every dollar for tuition instead of candles and cake. He remembered Caroline's frail hand clutching his, whispering that one day the boys would understand, that one day the sacrifices would be repaid in love. But that day never came. Instead, here he was bound and silenced, his worth measured not by the years he gave, but by the flesh they demanded. The weight of those memories pressed into him harder than the straps crushing his ribs, choking his breath. Nostalgia curdled into heartbreak, every cherished moment now poisoned by betrayal. The backyard ball games, the school recitals. He never missed the countless nights spent at Caroline's bedside. They were ghosts, flickering images in a life that had been traded for power and greed. He had built a foundation with his own hands, and his son's wife and her family had planted their flag on top of it, claiming ownership of what he bled to create. He looked again at Ethan Jr., that fragile figure trembling under the weight of truth, and his heart cracked with both sorrow and pride. The boy was the only one who seemed to see him not as a donor, not as a body to be exploited, but as the man who had carried generations on his shoulders. In those young eyes he saw the recognition he had been starving for, the acknowledgement that his sacrifices had not gone unseen. The father's lungs burned his chest, rising and falling with the jagged edge of grief. He wanted to scream at Caroline, to tell her she had been wrong, that their son had not grown into the man she believed he would. He wanted to weep for the years wasted, the love squandered, the trust betrayed. But he swallowed it all, locked it behind clenched teeth, and focused on the boy holding the phone. Because if the memories were an avalanche burying him beneath their weight, the boy was the spark that could ignite the air above. The father knew the truth was about to surface, that the secret clutched in those trembling hands would rip through the room like thunder cracking the sky. And as the static from the phone gave way to words forming sharp and undeniable, the father braced himself. The past was crashing down around him, but what was about to be spoken would decide whether it buried him forever or unearthed the justice he had been denied. Life has a way of testing the sacrifices we make, often in the most painful ways. This story reminds us that love without boundaries can sometimes be twisted, leaving those who gave everything feeling betrayed and forgotten. For older generations, it speaks to a truth many quietly fear, that years of devotion to family might not always be honored as they should. Yet it also reveals something deeper. The power of truth and courage can still break through even the darkest manipulation. A child's innocent defiance became the shield against injustice, proving that hope and integrity are never truly lost. For those who have carried families on their backs, the lesson is clear. Your sacrifices matter. Your voice matters, and your dignity must never be surrendered, no matter how others try to strip it away. And for the younger generations, it is a call to remember that the foundations you stand on were built by the hands of those who came before you. Respect, gratitude, and honesty are debts that can never be repaid with money or control, only with love. If this message speaks to you, subscribe now and leave a simple comment, your age, your city, or even just a number to remind others they are not alone in this journey.